Today with us, Paul Vigna and Michael Casey with the book called The Age of Cryptocurrency. So before we talk, I want to tell you a little story. Who of you were here when Google announced a partnership with Virgin Galactic, forming a company, Virgil, which would go and colonize Mars? Any hands? No, you don't remember that. Well, anyway, we did that as an April Fool's joke, and the response was tremendous, like 100 million views in the first 24 hours. And when people realized that was just an April Fool's joke, we got a lot of mail like, oh man, why not? It's time for doing it. And, today SpaceX is doing, something along those ways. So anyway, a couple of weeks ago, I noticed, on the internet that finance minister of Greece, Mr. Varoufakis, has announced that Greece will actually switch to Bitcoin because of all the financial troubles. And boy, I was surprised. And then I realized, after 15 minutes of research, well, that was a well-played April Fool's joke. And of course, the best April Fool's jokes are the ones that are plausible. So today with us, we have Paul Vigna and Michael Casey, who will get us into what is this digital cryptocurrency and, what is its possible effect on the economic systems, on the established order. Let me just give a brief introduction. So Paul Vigna boasts a collective 20 years of journalism experience as a markets reporter for the Wall Street Journal, columnist and anchor for MoneyBeat, writer and editor of the Market Talk column in Dow Jones Newswires. Paul has been a guest of the Fox Business News Network, CNN, the BBC, and the John Batchelor radio show. He has been interviewed by Bitcoin Magazine and appeared on the Bitcoins and Gravy podcast. Michael Casey writes for the Wall Street Journal, covering global finance in his Horizons column. Casey has written for such publications as Foreign Policy, the Washington Post, and the Financial Times. He's a frequent contributor to the journal's MoneyBeat blog and co-authors the daily BitBeat with Paul Vigna. He is host of the book-themed video series Wall Street Journal Afterward, and a frequent guest and host of the News Hub and MoneyBeat. He's the author of two books, Chess Afterlife, The Legacy of an Image, and one of Michiko Kakutani's best books of 2009, and The Unfair Trade, How Our Broken Financial System Destroys the Middle Class. Today, however, we will be talking about the book, The Age of Cryptocurrency. Please join me in welcoming Michael and Paul.
I have just become convinced within the last couple of minutes, actually, that our being asked to speak at Google was not an April Fool's Day joke. I was not at all sure until very recently. So thanks for coming out, everybody. Glad you're here. Glad everyone out in the world there is also listening. So this is going to actually function almost as two separate speeches. I'm going to talk for a little while, and then Mike is going to come up. I'm going to hand off to him, and he's going to talk for a little while. And the two, they dovetail. So hopefully it will appear like one seamless conversation. But you're getting two for the price of one here today. So, that said, the first thing I want to start off, I just want to ask a question, and not that you have to answer it, it's a rhetorical question, I'm answering. The question is, did the financial crisis matter to Bitcoin? Did 2008 matter to what happened to Bitcoin? And there are really different opinions about this. On the one hand, you look at it and Bitcoin sort of exploded right when the financial crisis happened. And on the other hand, there are people that say, no, it didn't matter. Bitcoin is a product, it is an innovation, it would have gone out in the world and done what it has done regardless of that. And some of the people who hold that latter view are extremely intelligent people, some of the people who are really involved in this, and they have a very strong opinion about it, that Bitcoin is a product, it is software, it is something that is valuable in and of its own right, and it would have gone out into the world and made its way regardless of when it was released. But I can't help but think that 2008 did matter to what happened to Bitcoin, that a decentralized, peer-to-peer, encrypted, anonymous currency system that came out at the depths of the financial crisis struck a very strong chord with a lot of people, and that's a Wall Street Journal. Mike and I write for them. And you talk about the period of 2008, and you talk about really the entire period from 2008 when the crisis started through 2012, through 2013, where you just had the entire global financial system lurching from crisis to crisis, just a cataclysm that threw millions of people out of work, that just waylaid entire economies from here to Europe and Asia. I mean, it really was a massive just disaster. I don't need to tell you guys what kind of disaster it was. We all lived through it. And what I think that helped do is you have this crisis, you have this, not just a crisis of economies, a crisis of daily, the stock markets, it's a crisis of confidence. You have this system that we're all born into, that we all grew up with, the financial edifice, that we never had to question, never really worried about it. Suddenly the thing seems unbelievably fragile and unbelievably shaky, and let's not kid ourselves too, it did crash, it did collapse. Governments had to come in and bail out the companies, the banks. Governments had to come in and prop up the system. I mean, this was an absolute collapse. This was a problem. And into that comes Bitcoin. Nobody knows exactly where it came from. Nobody knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is. He releases it to this group of cypherpunks on a mailing list. It gets very little attention at first. And what I think is interesting, I'm jumping around a little bit there, is that the cipher, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the cypherpunks, but they were this group of cryptography experts, very concerned about issues of privacy, about issues, all the issues that revolve around privacy and technology, and had been dealing with this for decades, and decades ago had been thinking about a digital currency, a coin. This is one of their prime ideas, had worked on it for a long time. All of these different precursors, proto-coins if you want to, they had all failed for one reason or another. So that by the time Nakamoto comes around in 2008 and releases Bitcoin, they've kind of given up. They've moved on. They really did not give it a lot of attention at first. But through this period that we're in, 2008, 2009, the crisis, it starts to gain some adherence. It's very small, but it starts to gain some very, very passionate people around this idea, and they are attached to it. And you can see this. What's really interesting too is if you go on the current, but if you go on the Bitcoin message boards, you can go back and look at the entire history of them. They're all there. It's all online. And in researching the book, I had done this. I had gone back and looked at it. And it's fascinating. You can see it goes from a couple of people to a couple of dozen of people to a couple of hundred people to thousands of people, and they are fueled by this idea of a solution to this problem that the real world is going through all the time that we're seeing these headlines about the crisis. This solution of an alternative currency that completely sidesteps everything that is giving us all these problems, and you start to see a community grow up around Bitcoin. And this photo, I'm very proud of this photo, because if you look in the reflection, you can see that's me taking it. So I kind of photobombed my own selfie. So that's my thing. And what you see in these years, this period of 2008 to 2012 really is a community of extremely passionate people coalesce around a currency, which is a really odd thing. I mean, to think of a counterculture movement born around a coin, even a digital coin, it doesn't usually happen. But this community grows, and it's techies, it's libertarians, it's people who are just kind of fed up with the system, and it becomes a cultural movement. It was really interesting. And what you start to see is, and I'm going to pull up here, this is some artwork by a California photographer named Megan Miller, who did a photography series on Bitcoin. And this is what you start to see. You start to see not just folks like you, technological folks, not just political folks, but you start to see people who start wearing the badge, as a symbol of something. And Megan's artwork I thought was very interesting. And so I just wanted to pull a little bit of it there. I'm just going to go through it quickly if you want. And this is what really started fascinating me when I started writing about it in 2013, was the cultural aspects of it. Why? Why do you have people, coming around this idea of a digital currency? And so you have Bitcoin artwork, you have Bitcoin graphic novels. Someone did a graphic novel about the hunt for Satoshi, which I thought was really interesting. And then this is a really good artwork too. This is by another California artist, Dave Kim, who did, I don't know if you guys, that's Dorian Nakamoto, who in March 2014, Newsweek said he was Satoshi Nakamoto. And Dave Kim was not into Bitcoin, but he was friends with artists who were putting on a Bitcoin-related art show. And they asked him to do a piece, and he did that piece. And I'm a little proud of the fact, too, that I helped him name it. He had a couple of different names. He didn't know what to call it. One of them was free lunch, and I said, well, it's got to be free lunch, So I interviewed him, and he said, yeah, of course, why not? So I convinced him. So you have photography, you have artwork, you have comics. This is another piece of artwork by Kuno Goda, a German artist, who did his 200 Bitcoins. And actually, I took a piece of it. I should have brought the whole thing, because it's literally a field. It's like an Andy Warhol type thing. It's 200 Bitcoins. It's the symbol. Why the symbol? I still haven't completely figured it out. I think someday someone's going to do a really fascinating anthropological study about this. You had people who did music. You had Bitcoin songs, and I didn't bring the songs along, but you had a bluegrass Bitcoin song. You had a Bitcoin love song. You had a Bitcoin rap. Nobody writes songs about PayPal. Why are they writing songs about Bitcoin? That's a Bitcoin ATM. It's actually a little out of place. I don't know why I put it in the slideshow. I shouldn't have put it in the slideshow. Let's go back to that. That's interesting. And this is what I think is really critical, is the idea of a culture, idea of a community coming around this thing. Because when you think of what a currency really is, we imbue currencies with a lot of power. We put a lot of mythology into what the dollar is. And who controls it actually has a very powerful tool in that mythology. But ultimately, a currency is really just an accounting system. It's a way for a group of people to keep track of what they have, who owes who to what, and to make that a very streamlined, simple process. What you have now, I think, with Bitcoin for the first time is you have a way to do that digitally. You have a way to do that online. You have a way to connect people who are now being connected through social media, but who previously could not be connected, who couldn't interact with each other, could interact with each other on a very limited basis, right? You could talk to each other on email or Twitter or whatever. Now they can do commerce with each other. They can send each other things, and they can pay for it. It becomes part of a whole. It becomes part of this evolution of this online digital community. And I think that if you didn't have the crisis, I don't know that would have really, the crisis was really like fuel for Bitcoin, and it really kind of put a groundswell underneath it, and the whole thing grew in a very organic way, very viral way. There's no marketing team that's pushing Bitcoin. There's no advertising campaign for Bitcoin. The whole thing was extremely organic, and it was all formed around the community. And in a very real sense, the community became Bitcoin. It wasn't just a piece of software. It wasn't just a protocol. It is literally the community that decides this thing matters to us, and we are going to use it among ourselves. And that's what you end up with. And I think that's a very powerful thing. Now, what the media still sees is something like this. This is Ben Lawsky's hearing in January of 2013 or 2014. 2014. It's a random. Actually, I should have taken this slide out too. But what? Anyway, you still have the sort of public face of Bitcoin, which is Mt. Gox, which is Silk Road, which is regulators trying to get their hands around it and hold hearings. And that becomes what most people think of when they think of Bitcoin. But it really isn't. It isn't that. It really is the community. And these slides I wanted to bring in because they're very visual, but it's really interesting. The guy, the large gentleman with the frizzy hair and the beard, his name is Huru Jackson, and he had invested in Bitcoin early and got rich on Bitcoin and used it to make a movie. The movie is called Amy in a Cage. He was an aspiring director, and he was able to fund it himself through Bitcoin. He hasn't released it yet. He completed it, and I just wanted to pull up some slides because, again, it's just an example of how people were using this for more than just, you know, a currency, a token. This became something that became a cultural art. It became part of their lives. And hopefully Huru's movie gets out there. I don't know what he's going to do with it yet, but I just think it's not actually about Bitcoin. This is Austin and Becky Craig, who in 2013 wanted to travel around the world using only Bitcoin to prove that it could be done. And they did it. They drove across country from Utah, their home in Provo, Utah. They came to New York. I met them at a Brooklyn pizza place, that's where they are, that was supposed to take Bitcoin. It was the only place in the city that took Bitcoin. So because they were only spending Bitcoin, they went to this Brooklyn pizza place to buy their pizza with Bitcoin. And then they got on a plane, they flew to Europe, they flew to Asia, and they managed to do it. They managed to go around the world spending only Bitcoin. Did involve some homeless nights, some foodless nights. It was not easy, but they did it, and they showed in doing it that, again, this was a community that was growing up around this thing, and it was really taking flight. No pun intended, actually. It really was growing. So this is what happened all through 2008, 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13. This community kind of grows. And in 2013, it really kind of explodes into the mainstream. And now journalists are getting interested in it. The media is taking notice of it. You still have all the salacious stuff. You still have all the salacious stories. But suddenly this thing seems to come out of nowhere. And people are saying, oh my God, Bitcoin is going to take over the world. Well, it didn't really come out of nowhere. And it really wasn't going to take over the world. And I think that was a problem for it because it appeared that overnight this was going to be a new way of doing things. And that was part of what fueled the rise up to $1,000, the speculation. Everyone goes crazy over it. And it put far, far too much on what is still something that is being built. I mean, it's really important to keep in mind that Bitcoin is still in a beta phase. They are still building the protocol. They're still building the system. And I think that actually kind of came to be a problem for Bitcoin because it couldn't fulfill those dreams. It couldn't fulfill everything that people were putting on it, and it starts to have some problems. And you can see there, that's just in the first quarter. That's and the rest of these slides, actually, I should give credit where credit is due. I cribbed these off of CoinDesk, which is a Bitcoin news service. They do a quarterly state of Bitcoin report. It's actually very, very good. 2013, Bitcoin hits its all-time high, falls all through 2014. The price comes down because this speculation starts to seep out of it. It's not going to take over the world overnight. It is not going to become this thing that challenges the homogeny of the US dollar. It was not going to happen. People start to get a little disillusioned with Bitcoin. They start to get a little bored with Bitcoin. But what was happening is a different group of people was starting to come into the Bitcoin world, and to call them, use a loose term, call them the suits. Money was starting to get a hold of this idea that there was something valuable here. The techies, the libertarians, had built something. They had put their passion into it. They had given a lot to it, and they built this thing, and they showed that it had value. Even when you have a situation like, say, the Silk Road, which is an online drug bazaar. It is clearly illegal, but as a use case for Bitcoin, it showed that this coin works. People could trade online, they could buy and sell online, and they could send the money to each other directly online. That's a powerful thing. Then you start seeing the suits get involved, and about $380 million of VC money went into Bitcoin in 2014. These are two of the big deals that happened this past quarter. Coinbase and 21 is the company. They got about, you can see about $200 million between the two of them. And people start talking about, they start comparing Bitcoin to the internet. This is another kind of valuable chart. It shows where Bitcoin was in 2014 in terms of VC investment compared to the internet in 1995. And you can see that there's money, there's real money coming into Bitcoin. People who care about making a profit, who care about building things that are going to be good for them in the long term, are starting to get interested in it. So that has become, and I think actually in 2015 that's a huge story. The idea that Wall Street is getting interested in Bitcoin as a technology, as a product, as you see the sort of the cultural part of it fade away, you're starting to see this business case be made for it. But Bitcoin is it's kind of reaching a crossroads. The really passionate people that were going to come on board early, the early adopters, the techies, the libertarians, the artists that really were looking for something new, that community has kind of saturated itself. Bitcoin has saturated that community. Can you find people outside of that are interested enough to get on board? That's another question right now. That is, and it's a problem. This is the number of Bitcoin accepting businesses added in each quarter. And you can see the number of businesses the growth rate of the businesses is starting to level off. Because businesses, they take it, they accept it, they say, oh yeah, this is kind of interesting. At the least we can use it as a marketing thing to attract this crowd. But they're not finding that there's a lot of business being done with it. So you're having fewer and fewer businesses, even though you have big names. Microsoft is using it in a limited sense. Dell is using it in a limited sense. Big companies are understanding there's something there. They want to experiment with it, but they're not seeing a huge groundswell of business from it. So that's another issue. And this is another slide. Actually, these next two slides, I think I'm gonna leave them up for Mike when he starts talking, because this kind of really gets to what you're interested in, Mike. What is Bitcoin going to be about? What is Bitcoin for? Is it really for first world US citizens who have access to all kinds of banking services, who have access to any kind of credit they need, using another one? Or is it really about people who live in emerging markets, people who don't have access to banking services, people who can't really build up the kind of wealth that we take for granted? That, I think, is where that is really what I find very fascinating about Bitcoin. That's what I think is Bitcoin's biggest, to use a phrase, use case. I think that is where Bitcoin is going to really prove its worth. And I will say too, me personally, when I got involved in journalism, I did it, when I got involved in journalism, I did it because I needed a job, and my only saleable asset was writing and editing. It was the only thing I could do well, so I got a job in journalism. But the reason I stayed with it was because I wanted to be able to tell stories that I thought were important. I wanted to be able to tell stories that I thought mattered in terms of improving the human condition. And in 2013, I realized that I think Bitcoin can help improve the human condition, and that it is part of that story. And I was one of those people that became that groundswell came under my feet, and I became very obsessed with Bitcoin, and I got very into it, and Mike also, and that's why we wanted to write this book, because we think there is a very, very big story to tell here, and we wanted to be a part of it in any kind of way. For me, writing stories is my way of being part of it. I'm not a VC, I'm not an entrepreneur, I'm not going to go into those businesses, I'm not going to start up my own Bitcoin app. I want to tell a story. I think Bitcoin's it's a critically important story, but I think it is also a story that is at the very, very early, I keep saying very, very, it's at very early stages. This thing's only 6 years old. Like I said, it is still in beta. It is not even at version 1.0. They are still building this thing. Over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you are going to see this go in places that we can't even think of right now. The way I look at it is, I think it's as if this is 1896 and we're all living in our little rural community with dirt roads that your horses go down, and you just saw the first horseless carriage go by, and it scared the hell out of your horse. It might have scared your wife, it scared you, and you don't know what it is, and it's very odd and it's very unusual, and your initial reaction is, that thing has to go. That thing is dangerous, that thing is going to hurt somebody, we got to get rid of that thing. There's a quote by, and I'm jumping around in my historical references here, there's a quote by a 2nd century Italian writer named Tertullian, who had said the first reaction to truth is always hatred. And I think that's a really kind of interesting way to think about new ideas. The visceral reaction to a new idea usually is hatred. It's doubt, it's skepticism. It is, this can't work. And I'm that way too. When I first heard of Bitcoin, I was the same way. I said, I'm not writing about this thing. This is a scam. This is a con. It's a Ponzi scheme. It's not going to last. I actually did. I said I refuse to write about it. But I kept thinking about it, and I kept reading about it, and it kept popping up in places. And then I started getting interested, and then I started reading more, and I started writing more. And the more I read, the more I saw there was to read. The more I wrote, the more I saw there was to write, and until the story just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think it is going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And where it goes from here is not exactly clear, and that's where I'm going to hand off to Mike, because Mike is going to talk about some of those things. And I don't think I went over time. I hope I didn't. But I'm going to hand off to my esteemed colleague and co-author, Mike Casey.
Thank you, sir. So you've left me some extra slides to work my way through. So no, but that's a nice slide. You didn't get to talk about it, but anyway, okay.
Actually, I should have, because I was talking about the unbanked, right?
That's right. Yeah, and the unbanked and property titling and a lot of really interesting use cases for Bitcoin, I think, are going to be very, very important down the road. But I'm going to talk about something a little different, and it is to talk about this concept of the crossroads that we're at. The transition from a very passionate community of true believers driven by sort of maybe some libertarian ideas and some very strong views about a kind of a utopian vision for the world. Those newcomers are not necessarily, they're a very different community, and they have a corporate flavor, and that's a very important issue for how we deal with the structure, the infrastructure of not just Bitcoin, but cryptocurrencies generally. And you guys, I think, need to think about this stuff. So anyway, I was pleased to see when I came in through the airport last night that there was an ad for this right there in the airport. So some of you actually may be familiar with it. This is an ad for Charles Schwab's new intelligent investing algorithm. For a while in Grand Central, they were running ads without the name Charles Schwab, just saying, investing will change forever, and leading you to believe that in March something really big was going to happen. But when I saw it, I couldn't help thinking how much it reminded me of this. It's kind of interesting that this comparison would be made, but if you look at them side by side, Hal and Schwab's intelligent algorithmic investing machine had the same spooky light in the distance. And exactly, this is the thing. Well, that's weird now, Boris, is what they've done is they're now running ads on TV with a spooky British voice behind it. How they would do that, I don't know, but it's so, Dave, I'm afraid I can't help you with your portfolio, I'm an Aussie, by the way, so I'm not going to get that accent quite right. But anyway, this matters, I think, this is a joke, and I certainly don't mean to pick on Schwab here, because the idea that you have a centralized algorithm, and this is the point, the idea that this is not actually your intelligent investor, as they're telling it. Of course, the algorithm is owned by Schwab. It's not your algorithm. It flies in the face of the Bitcoin ethos, if you like, that the algorithm really cannot belong to anybody. It needs to belong to the community, and it needs to be something that doesn't allow the centralization of information, and therefore the idea that some powerful corporate interest could morph into hell. And I'm not here to pick on Schwab about this, of course, because algorithms are centrally owned by companies all over the world, and I'd be remiss to point out that I'm speaking at the offices of the company that owns the most powerful algorithm in the world. So there's nothing wrong with this principle. It's just that it speaks, I think, to what drives the dream of the Bitcoin world, the idea that we can shift this out in a decentralized way. And it matters right now because as Bitcoin goes through this crossroads process, there's all sorts of other interested parties who are really noting how important it could be. We were talking over lunch actually about how there's a struggle that those of us who think Bitcoin's an important issue face with the way the mainstream perceives of it. And much as there is this incredibly passionate community that grew very quickly, it seems as if they've reached a roadblock, because once you step outside of the realm of the techies and the libertarians, the utopians, the fringe dwellers, if you like, not to cast aspersions on all of you tech types, but there is something, you are not Middle America. Middle America has a problem with it because they perceive and see all sorts of other problems with it. What's happening, interestingly, is that these guys are getting involved. They're getting involved, and mainstream's going, what? The New York Stock Exchange? What are they dabbling in Bitcoin for? why would you ever want to get involved in something that's being run by criminals? And yet it's happening over and over again. So you can see the New York Stock Exchange invested in Coinbase. Duncan Niederauer, who just coincidentally was the previous CEO of NYSE, he joined a Bitcoin swap site, Terror Exchange. This one's really interesting. Blythe Masters. Some people see her as sort of a sinister figure, but she really is a genius. She created credit default swaps, really. And she's now left JP Morgan, and is the CEO of Digital Asset Holdings, which is an interesting new settlement, digital currency and digital assets settlement service. NASDAQ are not investing, but they're certainly providing the tech for Noble Markets to build a new Bitcoin exchange. UBS just announced a new blockchain lab. And Jamie Dimon, who spoke disparagingly about Bitcoin about a year ago, now says there is much for us, that is JP Morgan, to learn from Bitcoin. So this is a sign. These guys are now getting interested. And it's important in the context of this centralization versus decentralization debate because they're all profit-seeking companies, quite rightfully so. I mean, as sort of Peter Thiel reminded us recently, you need the search for monopoly, you need the search for profit to drive innovation. The challenge, and I'm going to get to this later, is how do you prevent that monopolizing process from becoming something that kills innovation, that stifles growth, and that ultimately turns the rent-seeking activities that are inherent to monopolies into something really quite destructive. And this is the thing I want to come to in a little moment. But what's happening as this, this corporate mainstream interest is growing. We saw Paul lined out all the VC money that's coming into Bitcoin. This is another part of it. The Wall Street and other interest. What all of them are saying is this: I like the blockchain, but I don't like Bitcoin. And this is something that gets people in the Bitcoin community kind of upset. It need not, I think, but there's an enormous amount of passion caught up in what that represents to people in this community. What they're talking about and why people get upset about it is they say, look, it's impossible to have a blockchain without a coin. Right? This idea that you had no digital value because you need this coin to secure the blockchain. If you have all these miners, all these participants confirming transactions, why on earth are they going to participate in this network if you can't reward them in some way? So the idea is that the coin, that token of value, is critical for the building of value, the incentive system that builds the consensus model, and ultimately, therefore, the security of the ledger itself. It's not clear that they're necessarily right. Now, they are right on the fundamental question of decentralization. But if you just switch this around a little bit, and we just think that, well, what about if we had a centralized blockchain? What about, or better put, what if we had a permissioned blockchain, whereby the nodes, the computing, those that are providing computer resources to the process of processing transactions, were actually given some sort of authority to do so? That there was some entity that said, you know what, you guys are going to participate in this, and here are the reasons why, and there's a vested interest in participating, and for that reason, we have we don't need the coin because we've got an authority to do so, and we have a reason to do so, which is kind of the legal imperative, the mandate, the charter, whatever you want to call it, to do so. So we're already actually, to some extent, in this world where we have permissionless blockchains, Bitcoin being the best known, some of the altcoins like Litecoin, and Ethereum, the remarkably expansive idea of a new versatile blockchain that Vitalik Buterin, the wunderkind developer, came up with, all of which depend on the idea that anybody can come in and participate as a miner. And then you get permissioned blockchains. Ripple is probably the best known of these. I'm sure you've probably heard of Ripple, where there are gateways that participate, and they're ultimately given this role. And then there's these newcomers on the block, Eris Industries out of London and Hyperledger. And they're building blockchains that could be used in corporate settings where the focus is on the power of the ledger and the smart contracts that work within them rather than necessarily on coins and value. But when the Bitcoiners come back and say, look, this isn't going to work, you just can't do it, it still evolves into this question about why these companies care about it. And at the end of the day, there needs to be a kind of a commercial use for blockchains. And so companies are worried about Bitcoin because it has these sort of broader concerns that the general public is worried about. It is at the moment too volatile as a functioning currency. There is this problem of criminality, and there is the insecurity that digital wallets have. And some of these really are, in my mind, not particularly big issues, because I do feel as if innovation, even regulation, and just general network effects will eventually resolve some of these. Probably of greater concern are these concerns that sort of, I think, a more sophisticated analysis bring forth, and that are focused on the protocol itself. It has scalability limits, particularly in terms of data. The fact that it takes 10 minutes to finish a block. This is Bitcoin. Other altcoins are much faster than this. And it takes an hour to have a final confirmation. And then, of course, you've got this problem of the mining arms race, where the incentive system has actually built this massive race toward massive amounts of computing power. And the concentration that's been built around the mining pools on that basis leads to people to some concern that we could have a bad actor one day take a 51% control. It hasn't happened until now, and there are probably good game theory reasons as to why that wouldn't happen. Who wants to destroy their own value? But nonetheless, it's a legitimate concern that hangs over Bitcoin all the time, and a lawyer from a large company is probably going to feel uncomfortable with that very risk always being there. And then there's this sort of problem of consensus. Bitcoin's achievement really was the capacity to incentivize, to marry the incentives of the individual to the interests of the group, and to make sure that these things work together. It resolved, in some respects, the tragedy of the commons problem, where we're all pursuing our self-interest and destroying the public good that we have. But at the same time, the model as it's structured limits the capacity to sort of build out further, and so that same problem starts to reemerge, in that what really would be probably better for Bitcoin is to allow the capacity to innovate, to allow to sort of build this system out and grow on in a more kind of expansive and innovative way. But if you have to keep getting the consensus of everybody to do that, and nobody wants to do so because it's against their own personal interests, you once again are back to the tragedy of the commons issue. It's kind of like the UN. I mean, it's impossible to get the UN to do anything sometimes, because you just need consensus, and it's very hard to develop. These problems are being resolved. I mean, there really is some remarkable amount of innovation going on, whether it's Vitalik Buterin's Ethereum project, or it's what the guys at Blockstream are doing to try to build a side chain that would allow innovation to happen in isolation but connected to Bitcoin. There's a lot of work going on in this space. But at the same time, the corporate sector really doesn't care. They just want something that's practical and commercially viable for them. And so they're focusing on what they say they do like. They want to do away with this coin that they think is just too much of a distraction, and really who cares about whether the Fed goes away, and why do we need a community currency anyway? Why can't we just deal with some of the other cool things that this blockchain can do? And so they're talking about some of these great new ideas about fully auditable databases and how you could more appropriately manage them. The idea of smart contracts that might remove lawyers and escrow managers and trustees from the capacity of two entities to trade with each other. They like the idea of peer-to-peer real-time payments and settlement to make the ACH system, to really ultimately do away with ACH, and to improve the transfer of value around the world and free up all this capital that's tied up in that. Provable asset registries. There's a brief reference to under the SOTO in that earlier presentation that Paul gave, and he's got this idea that we could bring property title for the poor of the world, and place it onto a blockchain, this idea that perhaps we could liberate capital as a result of that, and then we could turn securities into digitized products and trade them. And so there's a lot of focus on these. This is what they like about blockchains. The advantages, none of this insane race to concentrated mining and the arms race we were talking about. It's a safe network because there's no threat of a 51% attack when a central company would manage the blockchain itself. It would be scalable. If this was a centralized model, you could just set it to the parameters that you wanted fast, and this UN problem goes away. You don't need the consensus of all of the participants to get things done. But ultimately, there's not much in the way of disadvantages, but they're critical. The very fact of centralization and the return to the idea of trust are potentially dangerous. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't potentially an enormous amount of value to be unleashed by moving to a centralized blockchain that would do away with the problem of the coins, particularly in a corporate setting. There's a bit of a debate about why on earth you would do this. What benefit could you bring to a company when in fact you could just run a smart database instead? Why do you need to sort of build this elaborate chain of interacting nodes within your company to fulfill these functions? There's actually been some interesting work done on this. Tim Swanson, who's in the audience here today, has put out a really interesting paper recently. People are focused on the idea that there's a smart contract. That's really what Bitcoin is. And so you could imagine, and I think that the jury is very much still out whether this is going to function this way or not, but a company could perhaps set up a structure in which different siloed units, different divisions within the company that have for so long had to depend upon these rules and processes, the requirement that XYZ manager has to sign off on this RFQ and this guy has to do that. And anybody who's worked in a big company, all of you have, at a kind of a management and procurement or any level that deals with the movement of funds and these things, it can be incredibly laborious, cumbersome, and bureaucratic. And the idea that you could now use a blockchain to automate a lot of those approval processes and maybe find interoperability between differently arranged software stacks and different parts of the world, you could perhaps develop efficiencies around that. Would it outweigh the cost of building that system rather than, again, a more sophisticated central database? I don't know. But I think the point to make here is that from a company perspective, who cares? Like, if you can actually prove that and a company can make life more effective for them and save money, go for it. That's a way to bring value, and every company should and would pursue anything that's going to save money internally for them. The concern, to get back to this problem about why centralization and trust matter, is not for that kind of a centralized blockchain, but what's being sort of described as the federated blockchain. The idea that an association of entities with a shared interest in something ends up working together to sort of supplant the role that the miners currently place in a permissionless environment. You'd have permissioned members. Now, the example I have there is the TBTF Alliance. Too big to fail, of course, is the reference there. And I wanted to throw out the idea that as those banks that are getting interested in Bitcoin and blockchain right now explore what seems to be one of the things they're most interested in, which is a more efficient process through which money and securities are settled around the world, removing middlemen, making that process far quicker than it currently is, so that you move from 3 days to 1 week down to virtually real time, freeing up massive amounts of capital in the process. Trillions of dollars a day are traded in world foreign exchange markets. If we could get that money to flow instantaneously, the impact on the globe could be profound. There could be great savings for the global economy. The problem is that if that were done in a model that is, controlled by the SIFIs, the systematically important financial institutions, as the bureaucrats now trying to deal with the mess that was the 2008 crisis described them, what are we doing? We're once again centralizing information around the power of these institutions. And what 2008 told us was that it's not just that centralization inherently breeds monopolies and therefore rent-seeking activities and ultimately denies people the chance to obtain products at a fair price, but it also, when pushed to the extreme, and certainly when backed by the political support that the implicit backstop that we taxpayers gave to banks does, it can be really destructive to society. We centralize information and control around institutions that have controlled the system, and it can do an enormous amount of damage. And here's the point, whereby if I think about Google as a centralized institution and its own clear profit-seeking motives is different from a bank, is because the infrastructure in which a bank is operating, the banks own it. It is already a centralized, controlled platform. All right? TCP/IP, for what it's worth, is an open system. It is there, and that is the thing that makes Google continue to be an innovative company. And regardless of whatever the EU ends up saying about you guys, there is a profound amount of innovation that happens here, precisely because you never know when the next disruptive competitor is going to be coming over the horizon. And that is possible because the infrastructure is available to all to exploit, to create disruptive, innovative new ideas. As we move into the age of the Internet of Money, where we are trying to move value into the same powerful, seamless, programmable world that the rest of the world has already moved into, the real risk here is that we deny that same capacity to the banking system, and that we end up with a sort of re-centralized model around their actual infrastructure. We don't care about what the app makers can do, what the banks and their profit-seeking entities can do there. What matters is that the infrastructure. What matters is the platform. So the concern is that as we go around this debate, blockchain without Bitcoin, the idea that we can have some sort of coinless structure here, I think it's absolutely critical that those of us who are invested in this, but I mean that as a society, because this truly is an idea that is far bigger than the kind of hobbyist notion that people, I think in the general mainstream, still think Bitcoin is. There are really profoundly important issues at stake. So those of us that are invested in that, be they writers, techies, or people in the finance world, it's beholden upon us to try to fight for the guarantee of some sort of decentralized, open-sourced basis to this transformation. And companies could and should and will do what they need to do. And blockchains that are able to operate in efficient ways internally may well be a fabulous solution for that process. But I just think that the passion actually needs to be sustained around this decentralization issue. And if at this moment of crossroads where we're going from, the fringe dwellers have handed the baton to corporate America, we lose out on the capacity to fight for the importance of this platform being a decentralized infrastructure. We face some very big risks. We don't want to go back to 2008 or some other version of that, and we certainly haven't fixed that problem. So it seems like an arcane debate, and I wrote a column on this yesterday that sort of sparked a lot of interest, and people get very upset about whether or not blockchain can be without a coin or not, and it sort of, part of the problem is that it gets lost in a world that the rest of us don't seem to understand, but it's critical. So I'm just going to leave you with that, and there's the cover of the book, which is actually on sale afterwards. You have to do the pitch, but we're happy to take questions. Do you want to come up and stand in?
We're going to use the microphone for questions, please.
Thanks for the talk. It was pretty good. What are your thoughts on the centralization of mining that's currently going on? I know a lot of the fringe dwellers, including me, were able to participate in that part of the decentralized system, but since about a year, I think that's pretty much over for everybody. So it's just a couple of large data center companies that own most of the mining hardware. How do you think that will affect Bitcoin as a decentralized platform?
I think it's the most important issue. I mean, it's and again, this is part of the debate gets focused on, oh, Bitcoin's too volatile and it's criminals. And that's the issue, because that talks to the core problem of the consensus infrastructure and how it builds out. Now, is it a problem that we have this? It's certainly a problem for a little guy who wants to make some money in it. To me, the issue is around whether or not there is a 51% attack concern. I mean, really, that's ultimately it. I'd love to think that we would be in a more democratic world and everybody could sort of participate in it. And maybe that is also an ideal that I think is worth pursuing. But I think a greater concern is that it is exposed to insecurity if it's just a case of just owning all the hardware. So I think the pools need to be resolved as an issue seriously. Now, there may be ways to do peer-to-peer pooling or something that moves that aside. But the other issue is, I have a pragmatic view about the importance of working with regulators and making sure that government has a view as to how Bitcoin is going to evolve. And to the extent to which that mining activity is now concentrated in China, for example, these are a lot of it is these data pools that are based behind state-owned enterprises where the Beijing government doesn't know that they're there, but some party apparatchik is paid off or is being paid off rather by the Bitcoin miner who's using the free electricity that's subsidized by the state to run this thing. It's hardly the kind of comfortable infrastructure that the US government's going to look to as the foundation for this system. So some of the stuff that's being done by companies here in the US, Bitfury is one of them, to try to sort of build a bridge to regulators to be much more transparent about their activities, how much control they have over mining, where their data centers are based, and so forth. That's probably the most important issue right now. I don't know how easily we can wind back the clock and allow you to participate at this stage. But certainly making sure that the threat of a 51% attack and that the security is under control, that's just paramount as far as I'm concerned.
Michael, could you do me a favor for the audience on YouTube who don't necessarily know what a 51% attack is? Could you go into details of what it actually means?
Absolutely. Okay, sure, yes. Forget with the YouTube audience, we've got a different audience from this one. So a 51% attack is the notion that the blockchain is a verifiable record of all of the transactions taking place in Bitcoin, so long as we can assume that nobody has the power to manipulate transactions and actually have the system approve fraudulent transactions that were double spent is the classic problem that people refer to, a kind of a form of digital counterfeiting, if you like. And the reason why it would be possible with a 51% attack is because if you owned more than 50% of all of the computing power that is distributed to manage and confirm the transactions in the blockchain, then by virtue of the way that the algorithm creates the blockchain chain, you'd be able to consistently enough win the awards for preparing a block and would be able to build blocks of your own interest, and that block would become the longest chain. Bitcoin's built around the idea that the longer the chain of transactions, the longer blocks in the transactions, that is that is the de facto legitimate blockchain, and that is basically the burden of proof that all the data behind it is true. So if you had 51%, you'd actually be able to more consistently build the next block, and you'd have the longest chain. You could ultimately destroy the system because you could put whatever you want into those transactions, and the system would regard that as the truth. So that's the sort of complicated problem that a 51% attack is, and it's something that's really been of great concern and a lot of debate for some time.
Hey, I got a question for both Michael and for Paul. For Michael, real quick, if you do trusted transparency, if you have to identify yourself as a validator underneath the scheme that Bitfury is working on, doesn't that defeat the whole purpose of having like pseudonymous validators if you have to dox yourself to be a part of the network?
I don't know if we assume that that's an inherent part of the thing. Now, I don't know, maybe there's different degrees of documentation that's there. Maybe there's certain aspects you don't know exactly where it is. To be honest, I don't know technically enough to understand how far you would push that. But certainly, the idea of some transparency behind it, I mean,
but wasn't the whole network designed so you don't have to be transparent? Like, it's the assumption that every actor is supposed to be pseudonymous and has its own, incentives to do a certain type of action.
Yeah, but maybe there's some degree to which there's enough information out there about who's involved, who's acting, how much you control. That is at least going to bring some sort of security to that network, even if where your nodes are and who you are is not actually sort of necessarily identified as who you are. I mean, I don't know exactly if it is, but I think that it's hard to deny that for the sake of confidence and trust in the system. I think this is one of the things that often comes.
But is it supposed to be trustless? I mean, why should you?
Well, this is the trustless and trust thing. I find, to me, trustlessness is this sort of holy grail concept that Bitcoiners have obviously held up as an important principle. But at the same time, it's never going to get anywhere unless there's trust in the system itself from people who use it and therefore from the government. The trust and confidence is the essence of money. So building some degree of transparency and openness and accountability around those who are working in this system, I think is an important compromise and bridging thing between those two concepts. Where you overstep the line and suddenly destroy all the value because all of a sudden you've lost the pseudonymity and so forth, I don't know. But it is it's sort of important to recognize that there's a challenge in that.
And I think to real true believers in Bitcoin, this is a core issue, right? The whole issue of identity, pseudonymity, anonymity. But to most people, I don't think they really care. Most people don't care. Most people broadcast their lives on social media, and I think this idea of privacy has been so eroded. I think most people just really don't care about it. They want a product that works. I think it's an important issue. I'm not saying it's not, but I'm saying that I could see somebody like Bitfury or somebody else come along and build a system that does not put anonymity as its godhead and still build a product that people would use. It's just a matter of what you think philosophically.
Okay, I have one question for you then, Paul. So it's already picked on Michael a little bit. So you mentioned that Bitcoin's in its early stages. Like maybe it's early stages for investors who just picked up on it, or journalists, or people interested on the outside. But from like a network security standpoint, it's already given up 2/3 of its mining rewards over the past 6 years. It's basically a senior citizen. Like we're depending on fees at this point to sustain it. It doesn't seem empirically to anyone wants to actually pay for fees. So in the long run, how would you say that it could stay as middle-aged or become young again from its senior citizen status in terms of network rewards?
Well, again, I think that's an issue, especially if you have invested hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in infrastructure to be the person, to be the miner, to be the node. The price matters a lot. The fees matter a lot, right? It kind of gets back to what you were saying. Idealistically, this would not be good for Bitcoin. But I would love to see the price go down to like $30 and see what happens there, see the shakeout there. And then you would have a situation where it would be cheap enough that you probably could do it on your own again, and the entire system resets itself, and you have a very different makeup of people comprising the system than what you're talking about now. That could happen. And I think, personally, I think Bitcoin's price, if it does survive as a product, if it does survive as a protocol, I think that price is going to come down, because I think as its utility gets proven out, its usefulness on a day-to-day basis, it becomes demystified, it becomes less speculative, it becomes just this thing that exists that you use. Nobody's going to want to pay $200 for it or $1,000 for it. They might think it's worth $30. They might think it's worth $1. It becomes much more useful and much less valuable, kind of like you wouldn't pay $1,000 for a hammer, but you'd pay $12.50 for a good hammer from Sears. And that's idealistically speaking. That would be a big problem for the people who have bought into the system right now. But I could see that happening, and you have a shakeout, and it's a problem, but other people will come in, and the system will reset itself and kind of move on. So, you know, it could go through some senior moments, you might want to say, but I don't think that necessarily has to be a death knell for it.
I mean, just on the question of fees replacing, Bitcoin rewards, and this notion that we've gone to a point where that's just no longer viable. Yes, it's obviously a challenge, and I suppose the question becomes, like anywhere else, where's the value proposition? I mean, if ultimately the fees have to rise to a level that they exceed, we end up with transaction processing fees that are something like credit card and Visa, then what's the point, right? So there's a concern, and it's a legitimate one, and I know there's a big debate about if we start sort of putting all this extra value on top of the blockchain and trading large property securities and so forth, who would want to do that if there's not enough background security? To Paul's point, you actually probably want the value to rise higher so that you have the opposite of that, so that you've got enough of a security base for big transactions to happen. The question that becomes, how economical does that become, and what miners require? It's kind of like, to me, we don't know, right? I mean, this is a huge, big experiment. What is going to be demanded, and what are miners going to need in return for processing the amount of information that's going to be passing across this blockchain? And it's an article of faith, but I think there is a sense that these problems can be resolved. I mean, we've gotten this far, and I don't know how. You're going to have a much better grip, Tim, on how this thing would actually be physically designed. But I just feel as if we've it's lasted this long. It actually has, and to your point, maybe it has become a senior citizen in that sense. We've actually, the good side of that, it's actually survived. It hasn't been destroyed. It has actually functioned to this point. And there's a lot of innovation and money and interest in making this thing work. And on that basis, I feel as if there's going to be ways to innovate. It might not be Bitcoin. I mean, it really is going to be a problem, perhaps. The 21 million might be the limit. The compensation system just might not be sufficient to sustain this. But at the same time, we've got the workings of a model. We have the blockchain as an idea. And my point is simply that whatever shape it takes, whether it's Ethereum or something else, decentralization still needs to be an objective. It needs to be a very important objective of how we take this thing forward.
But my understanding is a pool is still a bunch of different people, right? They essentially don't want to gamble with the might I find a Bitcoin ever or not, right? They just want some small portion of each Bitcoin that's found, proportional to how much they how much they invest, right? So how is this a danger?
It's a danger because of the way that they're
set
set
up.
up.
Two different things, right? I mean, you're talking about the big pools. You're talking about basically the contracts, the hashing contracts, right? Like you buy a contract and somebody has a small group and you get a little piece of it.
No, but you could be a
No, I'm talking about mining.
You could be you could have a hashing contract, or you could be your own separate miner. Either way, you still belong to a pool, right? So the pool is the way to efficiently distribute a piece of what's happening, rather than having to rely on the idea that just once you might win the next block 3 years hence, right? So it's a way to actually apportion out on a more steady flow what that is. And it wouldn't be a problem at all if the pool structure had nothing to do with voting power and the application of the capacity to determine what the shape of the blockchain is. But it's not like that. It is that the pool itself, it has the capacity to actually set the next block. The pool becomes the administrator of the blocking. It's drawing upon the hashing power of all of its members to then become the next block, right? So that gives it an enormous administrative power. I mean, that's why it comes up all the time when Ghash.io, which was one of the biggest pools, got over 51%. There was some great concern that they would use that power to launch an attack. Now they didn't, because it's not in their interest to do so. That's the other point of this, right? Why would you do it? That's proven to be enough of a defense right now. But the very prospect of it is still there.
If they did that, though, I mean, it would be obvious. Like, people would see it happening, right? So,
Well,
I think, too, the whole thing is, it's something that Nakamoto addressed in the white paper. I mean, this was something, he was the first one to bring this up, this idea of a 51% attack, and he ultimately rejected it because it is ultimately self-defeating. You're right. People would see it, they would understand it, and to the extent that somebody did take over the blockchain, they would drive everybody else out. The thing becomes useless, it becomes valueless, and everything that they invested building up to 51% or more becomes complete. They lose all their money on it. So, Phyllis, it's an issue, but I don't personally, I agree with Nakamoto. I don't think it's going to be a death knell problem for Bitcoin. I don't think it's going to happen because ultimately it is self-defeating.
That wasn't actually what I meant. I meant the individual miners who are contributing to the pool would notice, and then they would stop.
And then they would move it, which is the way. But it's the same point, right? Ultimately, that you would stop doing something that would destroy your value, would leave the pool and diminish its power, and therefore would no longer be able to do so. I don't know the degree to which you even know. I mean, that there's fraudulent transactions that are building. There's double spends that don't necessarily get picked up. I mean, I don't know enough about the technicalities of it. I would imagine it's actually possible for quite some time. And there's been quite a bit of research into whether a 51% attack is possible and how it might manifest itself. But that it might go on for some time. And what you're doing is you're eroding the value of the. People unaware of it are actually working off this what they think is the legitimate chain, and in the process are just actually undermining the reality and the effectiveness of the system. Now, I don't know, maybe somebody gets swindled, they raise their hand, the word gets out, who knows? It could very well come out, but that would be the defense mechanism. I think you're absolutely right. The idea that you would expect pool members to leave, diminish the power, and that would become the self-regulating system within that. The greater concern for me, though, just from this whole practical perspective of how does this become used from a commercial perspective and whether companies get involved, is like, if I'm a lawyer at Fortune 500 company, and I wanted to maybe think I should start using Bitcoin as for my international procurement or something else, and I'm the lawyer, I'm saying, no, look, I don't care. We don't, whether or not this is possible or not, this is a big enough of a risk that our, whatever settlement that we think we've done could be reversed however many months from now. It's just not worth it, right? So lawyers are incredibly cautious, and the very presence of a 51% attack, I think, is a challenge for that very reason.
So I think some of the early adopters got into Bitcoin principally because it's a better gold. It's a store of value. I think one of the questions as to Bitcoin's survivability is, what is it going to take for the rest of the population to sort of appreciate that use case? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I mean, because, I don't know that there's a good answer for it. That's why it's a good question. I mean, it's a problem. This idea of Bitcoin becoming a mainstream product, it's a problem. The solution, I think, is just time. This is something that is going to have to prove itself out over a period of years before people become comfortable enough that they don't think about it. I think, it's funny. I was thinking about this on the plane when I was coming over here yesterday, because I came over on a plane, right? So I flew from New York in about 5 or 6 hours. No, but I mean, think about it. I got on a plane. I got on a giant hulking piece of metal that went up 30,000 feet in the air, and in 5 hours transported me 3,000 miles. If anything goes wrong on that plane, I am a dead man. Dead. 30,000 feet, forget it. It's gone. I got on that plane without even thinking about it. I was excited. I was happy. I thought, oh, great, I'm going to fall asleep in San Francisco. That's a great thing. Because the technology has proven itself out over the course of a century. People don't even think about getting on planes. People don't even think about getting in a car and driving on a highway at 80 miles an hour because the technology has proven itself out over a long, long period of time. Bitcoin is going to have to go through that same proving period before the mainstream people use it without even thinking about it or worrying about, oh, it's digital money, Bitcoin, I'll pay Bitcoin, blah, blah, boom. It's going to take time for it to prove itself out. And if it can't prove itself out, well, then it's just going to die away, and it'll be another idea that was neat and interesting and got some adherents and didn't make it.
I'll just have one last point, because I just think it might round this thing out, and that is that I think absolutely we've kind of reached our plateau, our limit for how many mainstream folks are going to go say, hey, this would be a great tool for me to go and buy my groceries with. And for all the reasons we cite, it's just not a very attractive currency to be used. The big question then is, moving it to the next phase is how it becomes adopted by companies, how it's adopted by corporates, institutions, organizations. That's going to be the next phase, and we're probably going to have to go through that phase before we bring all of the general public on board. That's why this question that we're talking about here is important, because these guys have got a different set of motives from what the early adopters had, and that's why the debate is critical. But I don't think we could, the idea, the dream that we would just sort of like automatically move gradually through the population and we'd all sort of just start picking up this thing and using it to pay for our gas or whatever, it was a pipe dream. And therefore, the next phase is this corporate phase, and it's how it plays out is critical. So it's a way to round it out.
And on that note, please join me in thanking Michael and Paul.
Thank you.